It was a quiet evening, and Marcus was driving home from his late shift at the diner. The streets were nearly empty, with just the occasional car passing by. He rolled down his window slightly to let the cool breeze fill the car. It had been a long day, but he felt good knowing he had worked hard and was heading home to relax. As he turned onto a familiar street, Marcus noticed bright blue and red lights flashing in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. A police car. He wasn't speeding, and his car was in good shape. There was no reason to be pulled over, he thought. But he stayed calm. He slowly brought his car to a stop by the side of the road, turned off the engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. The officer stepped out of the car and approached Marcus's window. He was a tall man with a serious expression, wearing the crisp blue uniform of the police. Marcus couldn't help but notice how the officer seemed to be trying to appear intimidating, his steps slow and deliberate. "License and registration," the officer said firmly, not offering any greeting. Marcus nodded politely. "Of course, officer," he said, his voice steady. He reached into the glove compartment for his registration and pulled out his wallet for his license, moving slowly to avoid any misunderstanding. As he handed the documents over, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The officer hadn't told him why he had been stopped. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked after a moment, his tone sharp. "No, sir," Marcus replied honestly. "Was I speeding or doing something wrong?" The officer's gaze narrowed. "You looked like you were driving suspiciously. What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" Marcus blinked, confused. Suspicious. He had driven this route countless times before, and nothing about tonight was different. Still, he stayed calm. "I just finished work and am heading home," he explained. "I live a few streets over." The officer didn't seem satisfied with the answer. "This area has had some trouble lately. Are you sure you don't have anything in the car I should know about?" Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He knew his car was clean, but something about the officer's tone made it clear this wasn't just a routine stop. "No, sir. There's nothing in my car," Marcus said evenly. "I'm happy to cooperate if there's a specific issue, though." The officer frowned, leaning slightly closer. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, but kept his composure. He knew this might be the beginning of a long encounter, but he also knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let fear take over. He had every right to be on that road, just like anyone else. Marcus kept his hands on the steering wheel, his fingers tightening slightly as the officer stared at him. The silence between them felt heavy, but Marcus didn't want to make any sudden moves or say the wrong thing. He had nothing to hide, and he reminded himself to stay calm. The officer flipped through Marcus's documents, glancing back and forth between them and Marcus. "This car registered to you?" he asked, his tone sharp and direct. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, nodding. "I bought it 2 years ago. All the information is up to date." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly looking for something. Anything that might justify his suspicion. He tapped the edge of Marcus's license with his finger before folding his arms. "Where exactly are you coming from tonight?" Marcus took a steady breath. "I'm coming from work," he said. "I just finished my shift at the diner on 5th Street. The officer's eyes narrowed. "A diner, huh? Kind of late to be out, don't you think?" Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he kept his voice level. "It was a late shift, sir. The diner closes at 11, and it takes time to clean up." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step back and shone his flashlight into Marcus's car. The beam swept over the passenger seat, the floor, and the back seats. Marcus didn't move, keeping his hands visible on the wheel. His heart pounded, but he reminded himself that he had done nothing wrong. "Got anything in the car I should know about?" the officer asked, his tone sharper now. "Drugs? Weapons? Anything illegal?" "No, sir," Marcus said firmly. "There's nothing like that in my car." The officer leaned in closer to the window, his eyes narrowing, as if he didn't believe Marcus. "You sure about that? A lot of people say they're clean until we check." Marcus's pulse quickened, but he met the officer's gaze. "Unsure, sir," he said. "You're welcome to check if you have a reason to." For a moment, the officer didn't say anything. The silence was thick, and Marcus could feel his nerves on edge. He knew his rights, and he knew the officer didn't have a reason to search his car. But he also knew this could go badly if he said the wrong thing. The officer straightened up and took a step back, his face unreadable. "Stay here," he ordered before walking back to his patrol car. Marcus let out a slow breath, his heart still racing. He glanced at his phone sitting on the passenger seat. Should he start recording? Something told him this wasn't over yet. He stared at the flashing lights in his mirror, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was about standing his ground while staying calm, no matter what came next. Marcus sat quietly, his hand still on the steering wheel, as the officer lingered in his patrol car behind him. The red and blue lights continued to flash in his rearview mirror, casting an eerie glow on the empty street. Every passing second felt heavier than the last. Marcus's mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer's tone and attitude didn't feel right. A few minutes later, the officer returned, his expression more serious than before. "Step out of the car," he ordered, shining his flashlight directly into Marcus's eyes. Marcus blinked against the harsh light, but kept his composure. "Why, sir?" he asked calmly. "Did I do something wrong?" The officer's jaw tightened. "I said, step out of the car." Marcus's heart pounded, but he reminded himself to stay calm and polite. "Sir, with all due respect, I'd like to know why I'm being asked to step out of my vehicle. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer leaned closer, his face inches from the window. "Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" Marcus took a slow, steady breath. "No, sir. I'm not refusing. I'm just asking for clarification. I know my rights, and I'd like to understand the reason for this." The officer's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might escalate things. But instead, the officer straightened up, his flashlight still pointed into the car. "You looked nervous when I pulled you over," he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "That makes me think you've got something to hide." Marcus held back the frustration building inside him. He knew that no matter how he felt, losing his temper wouldn't help. "I'm not nervous because I've done anything wrong," he said firmly. "I'm nervous because this situation feels unnecessary. I've given you my license and registration, and everything checks out. I just want to go home." The officer's expression hardened. "I'll ask you one more time. Step out of the car." Marcus glanced at his phone on the passenger seat. Quietly, without drawing attention, he pressed the button to start recording. He then unlocked his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out slowly with his hands visible. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked. Marcus raised his hands slightly, keeping them at shoulder level. "Sir, I'm cooperating fully, but I want to make it clear, I have the right to record this interaction." The officer's eyes flicked to the phone recording on the seat and back to Marcus. For a moment, he seemed caught off guard, as if Marcus's calm confidence was something he hadn't expected. The tension hung in the air like a heavy cloud. "I have nothing to hide," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But I also won't let myself be treated unfairly." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear this wasn't going the way he had planned. The officer stood for a moment, staring at Marcus, as if trying to decide what to do next. The air between them felt thick with tension. Marcus stayed still, his hands still raised slightly, as he kept his eyes locked on the officer. He could feel his heart beating a little faster, but he refused to let the fear show. He knew he was in the right, and he wasn't going to back down. After what felt like an eternity, Officer Bradley spoke again. "You think you can just talk your way out of this?" he asked, his voice rising. You think just because you've got a phone and you know your rights, you're safe. Marcus shook his head. I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything. I'm just asking for respect. I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't think I should be treated like a criminal. The officer's face hardened. He seemed to take Marcus's calm response as an insult. You think you know more than me. I'm the one with the badge, not you. Marcus didn't flinch. I'm not questioning your authority, officer. I'm just asking you to follow the law. I'm not giving you any reason to treat me this way. There was a long silence as the officer took a step back, clearly weighing his next move. He was trying to assert control, trying to remind Marcus of who was in charge. But Marcus didn't waver. He wasn't about to be intimidated, no matter how much the officer tried to use his power. Finally, Officer Bradley spoke again, his voice colder now. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Marcus took a deep breath, lowering his hand slightly. I'm not making it hard, officer. I'm just trying to understand what's going on. I'd like to go home, like you said, but I also want to make sure I'm treated fairly. The officer was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with how to handle the situation. He didn't expect Marcus to be so calm, so determined to stand his ground. Marcus wasn't angry, but he wasn't backing down either. He was simply asserting his rights in a way that the officer wasn't used to. Marcus could feel the eyes of the people in the area on him. The street was still quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. He knew that if things went further, there would be people who would witness it, and that gave him strength. He wasn't alone in this moment, even if it felt like it at times. Just don't make me regret this, the officer said with a warning tone. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Marcus replied. I'm just standing up for myself. With that, the officer finally took a step back. He didn't say anything more, but his posture softened ever so slightly. The standoff wasn't over, but for the moment, Marcus had made it clear. He wasn't going to let fear rule the situation. As the silence hung in the air, Marcus kept his calm, waiting to see what the officer would do next. His mind was racing, but he held his ground, knowing that if he kept his composure, things would settle down. The officer was still watching him closely, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Just then, Marcus heard a voice from behind him. Is everything okay here? He turned his head and saw Mrs. Caldwell, an older woman who lived a few houses down the street, standing on the sidewalk. She had been out for a walk when she noticed the commotion. Marcus recognized her as a kind neighbor, always willing to lend a hand or offer a friendly word. The officer turned towards Mrs. Caldwell with a look of annoyance. Everything's fine. Just move along, ma'am. But Mrs. Caldwell didn't back down. I was just asking if everything's okay. I know Marcus, and I don't think he's done anything wrong. The officer's eyes flicked between the two of them. Marcus could see the officer's irritation building, but he didn't want to escalate things further. He looked at Mrs. Caldwell and gave her a small nod, silently thanking her for stepping in. She was one of the few people on this street who knew him by name, and seeing her there made him feel a little less alone. Ma'am, this is none of your business, the officer snapped, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I'm handling this. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't intimidated. I think it's everybody's business when someone is being treated unfairly. She took a few steps closer, her voice firm. I know Marcus. He's a good young man. He wouldn't be out here causing trouble. The officer seemed to hesitate, his face reddening as he tried to maintain control. But Marcus could tell that the presence of a witness was starting to make him reconsider his approach. Mrs. Caldwell was no stranger to standing up for what was right, and her words held weight. I'm recording this, Marcus said, his voice steady. And Mrs. Caldwell is a witness. I just want to make sure everything is handled properly. The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back, glancing over at his patrol car. The situation had shifted. With someone else watching, he couldn't just act on his own instincts. He had to be more careful now. For a moment, Marcus and Mrs. Caldwell stood there, waiting. The officer seemed to weigh his options, his frustration clear. He didn't want to look weak, but he also knew that pushing this further wasn't going to help him. He looked at Marcus, then at Mrs. Caldwell, and sighed. "You're free to go," he finally muttered, clearly defeated. Marcus didn't feel any satisfaction in the officer's surrender. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing up for his rights and making sure he was treated with respect. But seeing Mrs. Caldwell there, offering her support, made him feel stronger. He wasn't alone, and he wouldn't let fear or intimidation rule the moment. Marcus stood still, his mind racing, but his body calm. He had just heard the officer say he was free to go, but Marcus wasn't sure if he could just walk away so easily. The situation still felt tense, and though the officer had backed down, Marcus wasn't entirely convinced the ordeal was over. Mrs. Caldwell, still standing nearby, gave him a supportive nod. Her presence was comforting, and it gave him the strength to stay steady. She wasn't just a bystander. She had witnessed everything. If anything, she had made sure the officer knew he wasn't alone. "Are you sure that's all, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but not aggressive. He wasn't sure if the officer had truly let the matter go, or if something else was about to happen. The officer, looking irritated, glanced at him sharply. "What more do you want from me?" Marcus held his ground, taking a deep breath. "I just want to make sure I'm being treated fairly. You didn't give me a reason for being stopped in the first place. You accused me of suspicious behavior, but I've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't respond at first, his face showing signs of frustration. He seemed to want this to end as much as Marcus did, but he couldn't just ignore the situation now. There was still the matter of his actions, his assumptions, and Marcus was not about to let that go. "I'm just asking for a reason," Marcus continued calmly. "You asked me to step out of my car for no clear reason. I was polite. I stayed calm. But I'd appreciate knowing why I was stopped in the first place. It's my right to understand." For a long moment, the officer just stared at him, his face unreadable. The night air felt cooler now, and the lights from the police car still flashed in the quiet street. Mrs. Caldwell stood quietly to the side, her phone still recording, though she didn't say anything. It was clear that she was ready to speak up if needed, but Marcus had control of the conversation now. He wasn't pushing the officer to act out of anger or frustration. He was simply holding his ground with respect. Finally, the officer sighed. "Look," he muttered, almost under his breath. "I was just doing my job. But I don't have time for this right now. You're free to go." Marcus felt a small sense of relief, but he didn't relax completely. The officer hadn't admitted to anything wrong, and Marcus still wasn't entirely satisfied. But it was clear that the presence of a witness, the calm but firm way Marcus had handled the situation, had changed the course of the interaction. The officer no longer felt the power he had at the beginning. Marcus had refused to be intimidated, and the situation had shifted. "Thank you, officer," Marcus said, finally breaking the silence. He didn't want to make things worse by being rude, but he also didn't want to pretend this had been just a normal traffic stop. He had stood up for his rights, and that felt like a small victory. As he turned to get back into his car, he glanced at Mrs. Caldwell. She gave him another reassuring nod, and he smiled. This moment wasn't over, but at least it was clear that he had stood strong in the face of pressure. Just as Marcus was about to get back into his car, he heard the unmistakable sound of another car pulling up behind him. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he wondered if the situation was far from over. He glanced back to see another police car pulling in behind Officer Bradley's vehicle. The new car's sirens weren't on, but the blue and red lights flashed brightly in the darkness. The officer who stepped out of the second car wasn't wearing the same uniform as Officer Bradley. He looked taller, more serious, with an air of authority that seemed to settle over the street. Marcus remained calm, even as a wave of uncertainty washed over him. This wasn't the way he thought the night would go. He had hoped the encounter would be done, but now there was a new officer involved. The new officer walked over to Bradley, who was standing next to Marcus's car, still looking frustrated. They exchanged a few words, though Marcus couldn't hear them clearly from where he stood. The second officer nodded and then turned his attention toward Marcus, who was still standing by his car, his arms crossed but his posture relaxed. "Good evening," the new officer said in a more measured tone. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Bradley, still visibly irritated, waved his hand toward Marcus. "I stopped this guy for suspicious driving, but everything checks out. I was just about to let him go." The new officer nodded slowly, looking at Marcus as if taking in the situation for the first time. "I see," he said, his eyes scanning Marcus. "And you're certain there's nothing else we need to look into?" Marcus remained calm and answered confidently, "Yes, sir. I've been polite and cooperative. I've done nothing wrong." The second officer nodded again, but this time his expression softened a little. "All right," he said, his voice a bit less harsh. "I'll speak with Bradley for a moment." The new officer and Officer Bradley walked a few steps away, leaving Marcus standing by his car. He felt a bit of relief, but the uncertainty lingered. The presence of a backup officer usually meant that something wasn't quite right, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder if Bradley had called for help out of frustration or to push the situation further. Mrs. Caldwell, who had been quiet for a while, stepped up beside Marcus. "Don't let him push you around," she said softly, her voice full of support. "You're doing the right thing." Marcus nodded, grateful for her encouragement. "I'm just standing my ground. I haven't done anything wrong." After a few minutes, the officers returned to Marcus's side. The new officer looked at Marcus and then at Bradley, who was now standing with his arms crossed, looking a little less sure of himself. "All right," the second officer said. "Everything seems fine. You're free to go. Have a good night." Marcus didn't say anything at first, still a bit surprised by how quickly the situation had shifted. "Thank you," he said finally, trying to keep his voice steady. He turned and got back into his car, glancing at Mrs. Caldwell one last time before starting the engine. As he drove away, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The tension, the uncertainty, and the way the backup officer had handled the situation. He had stood firm, and it felt like that had made all the difference. He had been treated fairly in the end, but it hadn't come without a lot of pressure. As Marcus drove away from the scene, the flashing lights of the police cars slowly faded in his rearview mirror. He let out a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his mind. The night had taken a turn he hadn't expected. What had started as a routine drive home had turned into a test of his patience, his knowledge of his rights, and his ability to stay composed under pressure. He glanced over at Mrs. Caldwell's house as he passed by. She was still standing on the sidewalk, watching him drive off. He gave her a small wave, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. She had been his witness and support when he needed it the most. Without her, the situation could have gone very differently. Marcus felt the weight of the experience still hanging in the air. He wasn't angry, but he was frustrated. Why had the officer stopped him in the first place? Why had the situation escalated? But as he thought about it, he realized something important. It wasn't about being angry or frustrated. It was about making sure he was treated fairly, and in the end, that was what had happened. The situation had been tense, no doubt about it, but Marcus had held his ground. He had stayed calm and respectful, and he had made sure to assert his rights when needed. He hadn't allowed himself to be intimidated, even when the officer tried to escalate things, and that, Marcus thought, was something he could be proud of. Later that evening, as he sat in his living room, Marcus reflected on the events. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from Mrs. Caldwell, thanking him for standing up for himself and for reminding everyone of their rights. She mentioned that she had recorded the interaction on her phone and had planned to share it with a few people in the community. Marcus didn't mind. If it helped raise awareness about how important it was to stay calm and know your rights, then he was all for it. The next day, Marcus woke up to the news that the video had gone viral. People were talking about the encounter, and many were praising Marcus for how he handled the situation. They admired his ability to stay composed and stand up for himself without letting the officer push him around. It wasn't long before local news outlets reached out for interviews, and people from all over started sharing their own stories of similar experiences. While Marcus never intended for his encounter with the police to become a news story, he realized that it had sparked an important conversation. The video wasn't just about one police stop. It was about standing up for your rights and ensuring that everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, could expect to be treated with fairness and respect. In the end, Marcus felt a sense of quiet pride. The experience had been difficult, but it had also taught him something important, that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about winning the moment, but about making sure that justice is done, no matter how long it takes. The next few days after the encounter were a blur of phone calls, messages, and news stories. Marcus wasn't sure what he had expected when the video of his interaction with the officer started making its way around the community, but he certainly hadn't anticipated the attention it would bring. At first, the attention was a little overwhelming. News stations reached out, asking for interviews. Friends and family sent supportive messages, and even strangers commented on social media, praising him for his calmness and composure. It was strange to be in the spotlight for something that had started out as just a simple drive home. But Marcus realized that the story wasn't just about him. It was about the way the encounter had been handled, and the lessons that could be learned from it. The video of the interaction, recorded by Mrs. Caldwell, had sparked a conversation in the community. Many people had been impressed by how calmly Marcus had stood his ground, even when faced with an officer who seemed intent on escalating the situation. The fact that he had known his rights and calmly asserted them had made a lasting impact on those who had seen it. Marcus knew the video wasn't just about him showing up the officer or winning the interaction. It was about the message that came with it. The importance of being aware of your rights and having the courage to stand up for yourself, no matter who is trying to intimidate you. As the days passed, the news story began to spread beyond the local area. People were talking about it online, sharing the video, and discussing their own experiences with the police. Some shared stories of being treated unfairly, while others talked about how they had learned from Marcus's example of staying calm and confident in tense situations. For Marcus, it was a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself can create change, even if it wasn't your intention to make a big statement. He hadn't been looking for fame or recognition. He had just been trying to make sure he was treated fairly. But now, people were talking about the importance of fairness, respect, and accountability, and it felt good to know he had played a part in that conversation. A few days later, Marcus received a call from the local police department. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he picked up the phone, prepared for anything. The voice on the other end was calm, and the officer introduced himself. It turned out that Officer Bradley had been placed under review due to his handling of the situation. While it wasn't clear what the outcome would be, it was a sign that the department was taking the incident seriously. The call ended with the officer thanking Marcus for his cooperation and his ability to remain calm under pressure. Marcus felt a sense of relief. He had hoped for a resolution, but he hadn't expected to get a personal call from the department. As he hung up the phone, Marcus smiled. The whole experience had taught him a lot. It had reminded him that one person's actions could make a difference, even in the face of adversity. And while the situation hadn't been easy, it had ultimately led to a better understanding of how to stand up for yourself and hold others accountable.